Welcome once again to Breakfast Central. Moving now to Uganda, where the country rather has struggled for the longest time to protect its forest amid a population explosion that fuels demand for plant-based energy sources, which is of course perceived as cheap, especially charcoal. Now, according to a 2018 report by the UN Food and Agriculture Organization, reliance on charcoal or firewood is highest in Africa and Asia, with some African cities also almost entirely dependent on charcoal for cooking.
Some 25% to 35% of climate changing greenhouse gas emissions come from so-called biomass burning, which also includes seasonal fires intentionally set to clear land for agriculture. And this is of course according to the European Space Agency. Now, most of these fires occur in tropical regions of Africa. In Uganda, an East African country of 45 million people, charcoal is preferred in households across the income spectrum, but especially in those of the urban poor, seen as ideal in the preparation of certain dishes that require slow cooking. Middle-class families maintain both gas cookers and charcoal stoves.
Now, Uganda's President Yoweri Museveni recently issued an executive order banning the commercial production of charcoal in the area, which is now disrupting a national trade that has long been influenced by cultural sensibilities as much as the seeming abundance of idle land. Joining us now is Dickens Amanya. He is a research officer working with the Advocates Coalition for Development and Environment, and he has been following this situation. Good morning, Mr. Dickens. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you. Good morning from Kampala, Uganda.
Good to have you. The leading supplier of charcoal in the country, northern Uganda, has long been in the scene of, sustained forest destruction, with local leaders demanding a total ban on, commercial production. Now, tell us what this means for them, and for every other, company partner who has been, into charcoal production for a long time.
First of all, the ban itself was unprecedented, given that there were middlemen who used to involve themselves in the business of charcoal. Primarily, close to 50%, over 50% of Ugandans depend on charcoal as their source of fuel, regardless of access to other forms of energy like hydroelectric power. But in this case, there was curtail in business for most of the low-income earners, both in the city and up country.
All right, let's talk about what the options are, how Ugandans are actually coping with this. There are a number of people in Uganda who have complained about the inability to access other alternative means of cooking. There are people who can't afford this, and there have been some who say that the government should have provided alternatives before putting the ban on charcoal. So, what's your reaction to this, and how would you say that Ugandans are coping with the ban?
First of all, we are living in an economy whereby there is a high cost of living, right from the basic needs of the people, from water, food, security. So in this case, the degree of vulnerability is increasing, both in the city and in the peri-urban areas, and this is likely to increase high crime rates, especially the urban dwellers. In this case, have been depending heavily on charcoal, especially from northern region. But this has a far-reaching effect, given that there is no regulation, effective regulation of charcoal movement in the country. So there are illicit flows of charcoal, both from the region up to the city.
Yeah, but let's talk also, about what the Ugandan government is trying to achieve here, because I'm sure that they're aware of the, dependency on charcoal by, a lot of Ugandans, and of course the companies also. So what may have really motivated Yoweri Museveni to make this, ban, and what are they hoping to achieve?
I think in relation to achieving the efforts of the Paris Agreement of 2015 to combat climate change impacts, this is not effective. Why? Even yesterday, from other alternative regions, like for example, Bunyoro sub-region, there are lorries ferrying charcoal from the region up to the city center. So cutting off one region was not effective in my observation. But then too, when you look at the NDP, the National Development Plan 3 challenges it highlighted, was that there has been drastic change of deforestation from around 20% to 9.8%, right from 1996 up to 2019. So from 2019 to date, when there is rampant charcoal burning from Bugoma Forest, from Budongo Forest, these are key tropical forests in Uganda. So there are no clear statistics of the efforts the government has put in place to encourage reforestation. So cutting off one area as a form of mitigating charcoal burning was not effective in this case. So the only redress mechanism was to enhance community mobilization in terms of the steady progress to achieving the climate change objectives in this case.
All right, whilst climate change has become a big conversation in this regard and Uganda is trying to protect its forests and prevent the felling of trees, this business is still booming regardless of the ban. Someone had read up an interview that was granted by someone who said that even the police officers that are sent to arrest them are also using charcoal. What we've seen now is they have found other ways to continue with the business, transporting the charcoals with the boda. So what really is the future? In the nearest future, how do we see all of this playing out? Is this ban really going to hold up? Is the government going to maybe make alternative provisions to sort of alleviate the hardship that this ban is causing Ugandans? And I mean, Ugandans don't seem to be excited or to be warming up to these bans. So what is the nearest future looking like?
The ban itself might be effective in the long run, but the alternative sources of income the community would benefit from. For example, currently in Uganda, a liter of honey is at Ugandan shillings at a minimum of 20,000 Ugandan shillings. But when you compare it with the process of making charcoal, right from the tree, whereby someone will have a beehive, then economically, someone who has gone into apiary is more profitable than someone who is dealing in charcoal burning. But then too, Uganda is blessed with a lot of natural resources, rivers, streams, and lakes, which have potential dams to generate hydroelectric power. The only alternative in this case would be to lower the energy costs such that the whole population can access alternative sources of energy, but at the detriment of getting other sources of living.
Yeah, and that's a good point, and I'm just thinking about that. How does the average Ugandan, those who of course are on the lowest income bracket, how do they then move, onto cleaner energy? How does Yoweri Museveni hope that they can move into cleaner energy? Simply because of climate change, because you need to address some of all those issues first. You need to address poverty. You need to address, people on that income bracket, that are solely dependent on charcoal. They have no other option. And their ability to afford cleaner energy before you can completely ban charcoal. So is there any of those conversations going on? Are there any of all those plans by the Ugandan government to enable these ones to move on to cleaner energy?
Yes, the efforts are there. First of all, in 2019, the government enacted the National Environment Act as amended in 2019, and it stipulates the guidelines with the subsequent regulations, which offer people the chance to, one, work in wetlands, get wetland permits, have access to gazetted areas, even next to wildlife conservation areas like national parks and the rest. But then too, there are efforts under the decentralization policy whereby local governments themselves can pass bylaws and ordinances at lower administrative units. But now the challenge comes with the process under which the first bylaws and ordinances are passed at the higher level to eventually come and become legal frameworks. But then currently, we are under the review of the National Petroleum Policy, which in this case is likely to now come in with alternative sources of income at the larger scale. So we need to integrate, government needs to integrate such avenues, but also enhance one of its programs under the National Development Plan 3 of community mobilization and mindset change. So someone is indoctrinated that he or she can only get income after burning charcoal, and yet the same person will be getting exorbitant amounts of money through apiary, through aquaculture, and floriculture in this case.
All right. We hope that of course, government understands, what is at stake, and is not really just towing the line of climate change facilitators and the likes. But thank you very much for your time. We will speak with you again, I hope, very soon. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much.
All right. Let's move away from Uganda and answer what's going on in Zambia. The Zambian government will this month embark on an ambitious project to connect all secondary schools to the internet as part of efforts to promote quality education that responds to the current socio-economic demands.
Minister of Technology and Science Felix Mutati says the government has resolved to improve quality of education and make a difference in society through provision of amenities like the internet. Now joining us this morning live from Lusaka, Zambia is Miselo Boalia, Research Fellow Human Development. Good morning and thank you very much for joining us.
Good morning and greetings from Lusaka.
All right, it's good news. It seems what is being done or what is proposed to be done by the government for the secondary schools. But before we go into that, let's talk about what is currently obtainable in Zambia as regards the education sector. So what is it like? Can you please paint a picture for us?
Of course. Exciting news for the education sector, especially looking at where we're coming from. So firstly, in terms of the number of schools that we have, only 18% of schools in Zambia currently have access to internet. Now, these challenges go beyond having access to internet. As you know, teaching of computers in schools is something that's quite important as you look at moving towards the digital divide, looking at the digital age, and also getting to being an industrious country, which is part of the ambitions of the country through the National Development Plan. You also note that we still have some challenges in the education sector. For example, we have 55% of schools that do not have access to electricity. So while this is exciting news, there is still some way to go to ensure that we can actually actualize and fully benefit from this particular move. It's quite ambitious as well. We also look at the state of schools in terms of accessing computers. Currently, when you look at the population, the school population versus the number of computers that are available, you have 100 pupils sharing one computer. So that's sort of the state of schools in Zambia currently when it comes to ICT usage and access to internet.
Pretty interesting, and does this also shed some light as to where the Zambian government is trying to move the educational sector? Because if you look at the school curriculum from maybe the 90s, into 2000s and the likes, it's not very heavy on internet usage or information technology or anything like that. So does this shed some light as to where Hakainde Hichilema is trying to position the education sector in Zambia? Are they now going to be more focused on information technology and the likes?
Of course, this is something that is very important and is part of a long series of reforms in the education sector. So one of the things, firstly, that happened was the government made the teaching of computer studies compulsory, and it's also examinable. And so the next step is then how do we ensure that we provide internet access, computers, but also provide education in the Zambian system. Like you mentioned, the curriculum, obviously talk and cause for the curriculum to be revised, but how do we provide an education that allows Zambian learners to compete at an international level? So how do we ensure that they acquire an education that allows them to compete favorably, but also be able to take advantage of this new digital age all levels of production, all types of work now. If you look at the employment era, they all require learners to be at a certain level in terms of their ability to use ICT. And so this is something that is quite important. Again, another issue around this, which is also quite interesting about this move, the partnership with Starlink, it basically uses satellite to reach out to the schools. And so this is, I think, part of the biggest issue is that you will be able to reach schools that traditionally would not have had access to your traditional network that is provided through your mobile network operators, because this basically leverages on satellite. So even if they are outside the traditional coverage, you are able to reach them. So we hope that with this move, our government will be able to reach those secondary schools that are in far-flung areas, they're in rural areas, and they're quite difficult to reach.
Right. I think it's interesting that you're mentioning all of these, which sort of puts the whole conversation into better context. But let's talk about how the people are receiving the news. Whilst we understand that there is, of course, a digital gap that needs to be breached, and there are still other challenges that are plaguing the people. That in terms of, you mentioned electricity. Whilst we're talking about internet, there's still lack of electricity. There are a number of schools where you have hundreds of students to maybe one laptop or one computer. But how does this in some way spark some level of hope in the people that this is being done? How are they receiving this news?
Of course. So when you look at the current government's agenda in the education sector, it's been quite progressive. Remember, we're coming from a year where in 2022, we basically started to implement free education. So trying to get as many learners back into school. And then this was sort of coupled also with the recruitment of 30,000 teachers to try to bridge that gap. And like I mentioned earlier, there are quite a number of challenges in the education sector. So for example, one of the things that we've also noted has been through a decentralized fund, which is known as a constituency development fund, has been to try to equip schools with desks. So just ensure that basics such as ensuring learners are able to sit on desks as they learn, and ensuring that you improve that pupil-teacher ratio by recruiting teachers, and also implementing free education to ensure that you break those barriers that limit access to education. And so these have been quite progressive, and I think moving towards ensuring that all schools have access to internet is sort of a next step, and paints a very positive picture for the education sector. So in the last few years, there have been quite a number of progressive interventions within the education sector, and we hope that these will result in improved quality for the education sector.
Okay, well, we're also hoping, pretty much the same thing, but can you answer the question, if the Zambian government can afford these moves at this time? If they hope to provide internet to all secondary schools, maybe even primary schools, and then they also maybe would require to provide laptops, cell phones and the likes to ensure that they have, adequate, infrastructure for these moves. Can the Zambian government at this point afford them?
Okay, that's quite good. I mean, I think what we also need to have in the background is that we're coming from a situation where we had a huge debt overhang. As you know, Zambia is still in negotiations to try to restructure its debt. And part of this process is to try to free up resources, especially resources that will be used for the social sectors, which obviously include the education sector. So currently what we have is government receiving quite a lot of support towards the education sector. By support, I mean a lot of partners and donors coming in to try to support this. As the government also went to prepare its IMF package and agreement, part of the benchmarks in terms of progress towards this IMF deal, and part of the progress markers for the government was also improvements and investments in the education sector. Largely the long-term success of this particular program and the sustainability, especially on their sustainability, part of this will hinge on the successful completion of the debt restructuring, which will free up resources. Currently, we don't have as much resources. Our understanding yet, though details are not there also, is that the Starlink, which are basically the internet providers, were issued a license. And part of this, or part of the effort to provide internet in schools, is sort of some sort of social corporate responsibility. So it's a package that comes with giving them an operating license. So we understand that they will be able to also provide internet at competitive rates, so compete for those that are able to pay for it. But part of this agreement is to then ensure that they also provide internet in schools. So our understanding is actually that the provision of the internet in schools will be somewhat subsidized through the agreement that was made by the government. But you are right that the long-term sustainability will largely hinge on the country's ability to successfully negotiate a debt restructuring, which should free up some resources to manage some of these ambitious interventions within the education sector and the social sectors generally.
All right. Thank you very much for breaking that down for us. We hope that the country, Zambia, is able to, meet up with these expectations and these promises it's made to the people, and, that the education sector can get the necessary revamp that it needs. Thank you for your time with us this morning.
Thank you.